Hello and welcome to the channel. As always, like the video, and if you enjoyed the story, leave a comment on if you would want more. This fan fiction was not created by me, but in the description there is a link to the fanfic so you can show your support to the creator and read along. Without any more delay, let's dive into the story.
Chapter 4. Today is a day for deeds of greatness. Naruto declared to the sky from atop the Hokage monument. Then, turning around, he addressed his army of shadow clones. "Are you ready then?" "Yes," came the responding roar of 400 throats raised in unison, paintbrushes held high aloft. "Forward!" the real one shouted, pointing off the cliff. With a roar, they surged ahead, Naruto in the lead, racing off the top of the mountain to run down the face of it, feet sticking to the side. And, just as fast as a waterfall or a curtain being dropped, the entire Hokage monument got painted in brilliant shades of red, yellow, blue, white and orange. "Hey Sakura," the orange-clad ninja cried out to his teammate just before the first test started. "I bet you're going to stand up, or shout, or do something stupid to get our team thrown out of this test." Naruto, the annoyed pink-haired Kunoichi shouted. "I would never do such a thing." The blonde boy folded his arms. "I said I'd bet you, Sakura-chan. How about, if you do, and I win, then you have to give up on Sasuke. But if you don't, and I lose, I don't ask you out anymore?" "No way. I would never bargain away my relationship with Sasuke, even on a sure thing like that," she shouted, then turned to bat her eyes to her crush. "You see, Sasuke-kun? Nothing can tear us apart." The last Uchiha rolled his eyes in disgust. "Hey Sakura," the orange-clad ninja cried out to his teammate just before the first test started. "I bet you're going to stand up, or shout, or do something stupid to get our team thrown out of this test." Naruto, the annoyed pink-haired Kunoichi shouted. "I would never do such a thing." The blonde boy folded his arms. "I said I'd bet you, Sakura-chan. How about, if you do, you ask Kiba out instead of Sasuke at the end of this period, and if you don't, I'll start asking Ino out instead of you?" "That's disgusting. Go out with that hairy animal? I'd rather die." Kiba, who was standing nearby, cracked his knuckles and bared his fangs, growling angrily, "That can be arranged." "Hey Sakura," the orange-clad ninja cried out to his teammate just before the first test started. "I bet you're going to stand up, or shout, or do something stupid to get our team thrown out of this test." Naruto, the annoyed pink-haired Kunoichi shouted. "I would never do such a thing." "Okay, let's bet. Say you do, then you have to wear whatever outfit Ino picks out for the rest of the day. If not, then I'll wear the same thing she'd picked out for you for the same period." "You're on." Ino was also grinning. "Oh, I've got just the outfit, too." "Quiet down." Ibiki entered the exam room, explained the rules and got all of the genin to their seats. Mere minute into the exam, however. "I'm done," Naruto cried at the top of his lungs, flipping his test sheet over. Then he turned to take Hinata's hands in his, and, looking into her eyes, asked, "Hinata darling, are you done as well?" "Why, yes," she squeaked, turning bright red. "Then turn your paper over," he softly suggested, gently reaching out and taking her into a hug. "We have 40 minutes left until the 10th question." The amazingly fast motion as she flipped her paper face down was not lost on anyone, nor was her blush or the smile steadily creeping up on her face as she melted into his hug. "Oh, Hinata-chan. You are so lovely. I must kiss you," and then Naruto did so, with the benefit of plenty of makeout sessions behind him. Several of the other genin nearby started to whoop and make catcalls. Naruto. Hinata cried out as he nibbled a particularly sensitive spot at the base her neck, clinging to him for all her might. "Naruto!" Sakura screamed, rising from her desk at this unseemly public display of affection. Then out of the corner of her eyes she caught one of the test proctors making a careful note on his clipboard, and sank meekly back down in her chair again, ashamed as her memory prompted her about the bet. But why was Naruto baiting her, and when did he learn how to kiss? Ibiki, standing in front of the two embracing students and pretending indifference to them, picked up their test papers and quirked an eyebrow at them. Interesting. Those were not the same answers his plants would provide, but they were detailed, complete, and correct for all he could tell, and though the papers were identical to each other, no one had caught them, not when they copied each other's answers, nor when they'd somehow rigged it to have adjacent seats. Interesting. These two would bear watching. A. A-H-H-H. Hinata shrieked out, lost to the world around her. Ibiki looked around the class. Well, no one was obviously treating this as a coded message, from what he could tell. And though it wouldn't be too hard to encode moans and gasps like that, unless they could actually catch them transmitting data, they couldn't count it as having caught an attempt to cheat, not so long as the couple acted out their roles so well. An ingenious strategy actually, and a command performance carrying it out. That took talent. He almost believed they were doing it just for the fun they were having. So even though he knew this could be no more innocent than the dog barking, he couldn't do anything unless they messed up and got caught. No, these two would bear watching indeed. It's not fair. Sakura complained, looking askance at Naruto. You even have a better figure than I do. What do you expect? It's a variant of the transformation technique. I can look however I want, Naruto-chan told her, presently in his sexy technique disguise of a buxom blonde girl, and wearing a lacy teddy with silk stockings. And Ino has excellent taste. What I want to know is how you held your nerve for the entire test. It wasn't easy, the pink-haired one complained at low volume, looking away from her teammate. Hinata sighed fondly, sitting on the floor with her arms wrapped around Naruto-chan's legs, and head laying in her lap, where Naruto was pleasantly stroking her hair. You aren't going to stay inside all day, are you? Ino teased. Why, yes, as a matter of fact, I am. Do you know how many perverts there are out there? Naruto-chan teased right back at her. Yeah, loads. Ino shrugged. 387, Naruto corrected. And one closet pervert. Hinata sighed softly yet loudly, warm in her contentment. Sakura's eyebrow twitched. Make that 88, she grumbled. True to form, Ebisu worked with him until Naruto could perform the body switch technique quickly and effortlessly, needing very little warning before activating it. Actually, the skill gave a great tactical advantage to Naruto, as he grew good enough at it his shadow clones could now use the technique without a serious drain on their chakra stores, which meant they could use it to escape from blows that might otherwise destroy them, multiplying their effectiveness and survivability drastically. They still couldn't take a hit, but they could evade one far more easily. That made them more than a human blitz attack, as they could still charge in a wave, but no longer did they need to be replaced for each attack, as some would almost certainly survive to continue the assault. Also, the real Naruto could be far more easily and completely protected by his clones, setting aside a bodyguard group who, instead of leaping in front of blows to shield him, something that didn't often work, especially when a foe used attacks that could go right through several bodies in a row, they could hang back, and use body switch to replace him at crucial moments, getting him out of combat before the nasty attacks hit. Naruto almost immediately hit on a battle strategy where his clones would leap at a foe, as usual, then body switch out so their target would be struck by a hail of logs and small boulders before the clones once again rushed in to attack the hopefully bruised opponent during the distraction. So, once again he had multiplied the value of his mass clone attacks by fully mastering one of the basic three under Ebisu. And, once again, it failed to make any difference when facing Orochimaru. Although, it did take the Sannin slightly longer to kill him this time, so that was sort of a success. So, the transformation technique, huh? Naruto asked Ebisu the next time they met. The special Jonin was impressed. How did you guess? Oh, just a feeling, Naruto groaned, depressed. Perform the technique. I want to see where you are so I know what you are missing. Forming the seal, the blonde boy transformed into a copy of Irika in a puff of smoke. Ebisu examined the disguise for a moment, then he stepped back and straightened his glasses. Not bad. Far from useless, actually. You still rely too much on a stance and concentration. We shall have to train that out of you so you can do it on the move. Your puff of smoke is far too obvious. We must reduce it. Ideally, you must eliminate that entirely, and you'll want to be able to perform the technique on short notice even when surprised. Still, for all your clumsy execution of it, the results are nearly flawless. I am having trouble finding any of the usual telltales or signs that this is an illusion. What are you talking about? The Naruto/Iruka asked, confused. All illusion techniques are vulnerable, Ebisu instructed. They have weak points, and are limited by the imaginations and power of those who create them, in addition to being limited by skill. So, details will be incorrect, edges may blur, and the interaction with the environment will all be flawed. But in your case, well, look at your feet as an example. An excellent job. I am honestly surprised. Naruto/Iruka lifted both of his feet, one at a time, to look at them, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. What are you talking about? The special Jonin folded his arms and huffed. Naruto, don't treat me as a fool. You are not Iruka. You are smaller than him, for one. My first impulse would be to scold you for choosing a shape too far different from your own to hide in, but I won't, as you execute it flawlessly. Huh? Naruto was shaking his head in confusion. Ebisu sighed, shoving his glasses back up his nose. Naruto, you cannot be ignorant of this. I know there is a story going around the younger students of someone who transformed into a shuriken and was thrown by another member of his team to surprise an enemy, but such tall tales are ridiculous. The technique does not work that way. All that transformation does, all it ever can do, is to cloak you in an illusion. It has not ever been a real change, wild rumors to the contrary, nor can it ever be. 1. For a boy who seeks so much approval, I am surprised you reject my compliments on your technique. The special Jonin waved to him as he listed off points. In the first place, your feet are smaller than Iruka's. Being a simple illusion, the grass you stand on should poke through the image where your feet aren't, but his would be, yet you have already accounted for that and covered it, enhancing your illusion so that it seems as if the grass bends under the full impression of the foot. Nor are you blurred or incomplete. It is quite frankly one of the better images I have ever seen worn, Jonin level easily. I was unaware you were trying to become a stealth and infiltration specialist. But you must be, to have worked so hard on this technique. It must have taken you months to get the Iruka disguise this perfect. Tell me, have you practiced any others? Shocked, momentarily speechless, Naruto formed the set of seals again, and in a poof of smoke was replaced by the image of the third Hokage. Most impressive, Ebisu walked around him, rubbing his chin thoughtfully as he judged the image. I could almost believe it was him. Then Naruto/Hokage reached out and pinched his nose. Kwa! The special Jonin leaped back several feet, limbs splayed in surprise, before he recomposed himself and straightened his glasses. I must give you credit, Naruto. Precisely matching the movements of your illusion to yourself, particularly when it is of a shape taller and with longer reach than you, that is a skill that will serve you well at infiltration. I did not expect it from you. That is a very advanced technique. Naruto/Hokage grinned from ear to ear. I'm not an illusion. The special Jonin's glasses fell down his face as his jaw dropped in shock. Then he was all over Naruto, patting him on his head, shoulders, testing that his arms were real and solid, then frisking him all over. Forgive me, Hokage-sama. The special Jonin bowed. But, what has become of my student? With a puff of smoke, the technique got released and Naruto stood there. I'm still here. Once again the special Jonin had to pat him all over before he could believe it was really him. Then, composure lost entirely, he stuttered, You mean, but... When I change, I really change, the boy confirmed. Instantly the special Jonin was standing by his side, hand over his mouth and eyes alert for witnesses able to overhear this conversation. When he found none, he whispered into Naruto's ear. You must never tell anyone of this, Naruto. As of this moment, you must consider your transformation an S-rank technique. It is capable of foiling the security of practically any ninja village. We cannot allow this to fall into enemy hands. Have you taught anyone else your version of the technique, as you use it? Yeah. Konohamaru, your other student. I taught him as part of sexy technique. The boy blinked. Ebisu was standing across from him and bowed. Naruto, I must apologize. You are indeed a genius of the highest caliber. I thank you for your gift to my other student. Now, I must go report to the Hokage this information. Wait! Naruto called out, stopping him. Can't you give me a few hints on how to refine my smoke and stuff, first? Of course, Naruto. The special Chunnin fixed his glasses. I can spare you the time for that. An hour later, after Ebisu had left to report this information, a giggling Naruto discovered that the scroll of forbidden seals was under more guards and security than the last time, including a seal array that the Hokage knew how to deactivate, but Naruto didn't. So much for the short route to power. Probably the best thing Irika had ever done for him, Naruto reflected, was teach him how to read. If only it hadn't taken a time loop for him to do it properly. All of those other things people took for granted, the village pariah had had to struggle for. No one had ever taught him things others took for granted. Not having parents, or any reliable adult figures, really, he could not get the most basic assistance on most matters. So, for most of his life, he'd gone without crucial knowledge, and a big part of that was having a literacy level on par with most preschoolers. Most of the time he'd spent studying the scroll of forbidden seals was trying to get what the various kanji meant, and most of the work he'd done on the skill was in studying the pictures, then trying out variations on themes to guess the correct combination to activate the technique. And he'd beaten himself up pretty badly during the process. It was the same way with his other techniques, only in one case that seemed to have done him a good turn, at least with regards to the transformation technique. The version he'd cobbled together on his own did what he thought the technique should have done, rather than what everyone else did. But still, overall, the inability to read well had been a major hindrance to him, all his life long. His schoolwork had stunk, but most of the reason behind his low grades came from his inability to read textbooks, and the few kanji he knew were mostly learned by watching and listening to what the teacher wrote on the board during classes. The reason he'd attended at all, when mostly he'd rather be skipping out on boring lectures to do stuff that was interesting. Now, however, well, that was one of the first things corrected by his time studying with Irika during this endlessly repeating loop. But it had taken so long to do properly, it was only now beginning to bear fruit. And it made such a difference in his life. It was like his functional illiteracy had been a huge chain holding him back. Without that impediment, it was revealed that he easily had one of the finest minds in the village. Sakura? Bah! She had nothing on him. The highest grades in their year, and yet she didn't have half of his brilliance, now that it was allowed to shine. Whatever wall the villagers had wanted to erect around him to keep him from growing was now broken. Because he could read, really read, not puzzle out a few kanji here or there and puzzle out some of the rest by context, he could look up information by himself, no longer depending on whatever scraps they wanted to dole out, which was always the least they could get away with. Freed of his ignorance, Naruto's mind was now shooting forward in making up for lost time. First recovering to where it ought to have been for his age level, and then rapidly shooting higher. While teaching him the answers to the Chunnin exam, Irika had brought his literacy level up to where it should be for his age. Now Naruto kept pressing it higher. All of his life he'd been limited to knowing only what others had been willing to teach him, which meant that he knew nothing. Or at least nothing they could get away with forgetting to share with him. The ability to read changed that whole paradigm. Now he could find out things for himself, all he had to do was find it in a book. And books didn't hate him or want to keep him ignorant. They were willing to share with anyone who opened their covers. It didn't matter to them he was a demon container, shunned and avoided by everyone, the most unpopular boy in the village. Books quickly became some of his best friends. Why? Because he could learn stuff from books. There was all sorts of things hidden out in there, like the names of Orochimaru's apprentices, and the history of Konoha, all of the stuff he'd missed out learning during class, as well as stuff the average villagers didn't know. Whatever he wanted to know, it seemed there was an answer in books. Case in point, Naruto giggled to himself, was the dating and courtship book he was now holding. In it were all kinds of suggestions and rules no one had ever thought to tell him about. It was amazing, really. It filled in the gaps between what the giggling Kunoichi could tell him about, and what Kurenai expected him to be able to understand. Naruto had already made some progress on that whole romance thing, enough so that by now when he was thinking about it, he was, for a 12-year-old boy, fairly smooth. Of course, that wasn't saying much, as boys his age were still all remarkably crude, but he was getting to where he was no longer an abomination offensive to the female sex. Of all of the ways the villagers' hatred had stunted him, his social ignorance was the worst. He'd literally had no idea how normal people interacted. The villagers had made sure of that. But, now that the dam of his ignorance had burst with him learning how to really read, he was able to correct that. The library was full of novels of how normal people treated each other. It was fascinating to the boy, like a light shining forth in a room deliberately held dark all this time. It was liberating in a way he could not even describe. Once he'd crested the limit of functional literacy, he'd immediately gone and hidden out in the public library for a couple of months, reading as a man who was parched and thirsty might drink, not even caring about the Chunnin test. It changed his life. And, not surprisingly, his angry teammates never found him there. But having been empty-headed, now he wanted to be filled. And all of the roadblocks he'd been up against seemed to have their answers now. His dates with Hinata had kind of gotten stuck in a rut, and so he decided to try something new concerning them, giving up on restaurants entirely to throw her a party at his house. It was a disaster of the worst sort. Naruto's home was hardly tidy at the best of times, barely clean, and only somewhat livable. It was obvious on taking her there that Hinata found the place horrible, although to tell by her reaction, it was not the first time she'd seen it, which was odd, as it was certainly the first time he'd invited her. But you know what? Now he could learn from that. Having read a detective novel or two, he understood about looking for clues. Her having seen his apartment before meant something. So he'd asked her about that after the next switch, and she'd stuttered out an apology like she'd been caught in some horrible atrocity. Her crime? She'd liked him since they'd been small, and had watched him from a distance, always there, but never brave enough to step in and help. And yet, confronted about it, she treated it as though she'd been doing some horrible thing. Naruto had to laugh. Here, the mystery person who'd given him presents for his birthday, left on his doorstep year after year, probably the one person in town who'd liked him growing up, was afraid that she'd done something awful by liking him. It was too much. He had to laugh. Now in the past he would have done that by falling on the ground and rolling around, and she would have run off crying, utterly crushed by his response. But now that he had a few romance novels under his belt, so to speak, he knew enough to hug her and chuckle into her hair in between whispers that it was all right, explaining to her as he had breath exactly what he'd been thinking, that she'd been the nicest person in the whole world to him, and expecting him to be angry for that was silly. The way he explained it even made her chuckle a bit along with him, mostly that was in relief that he didn't hate her, however. No, things had definitely turned a corner in his life now. It was never going to be the same again. And he started out by asking Hinata about her life. Pust. Hinata-chan, are you awake? Eep. The lavender-haired girl came awake in fright, only to see Naruto there with the goggles she'd once given him on his head where his headband used to be. His ninja marker now hung around his neck, like hers did. Before she could conclude anything, he was leaning closer. I'll leave so you can get dressed. I just hoped we could walk to the exam together. After all, I just discovered the cutest girl in our class was also the one who has been giving me presents all these years. Thank you, Hinata-chan. He bent close to place a kiss on her unresisting forehead. You believed in me. That, more than anything, is what kept me going. Then he was gone. She hurried to wash herself and scramble into her clothes. Naruto was waiting for her by the gate. So high she was that her longtime crush had finally discovered, and liked her, that her feet barely hit the ground as they chatted along on their way to the center. She was walking on clouds the entire time. It never occurred to her to wonder how he knew the guard schedule and sentry posts around the Hyuga complex well enough to sneak into her room, or that they couldn't have their bloodline active all of the time due to chakra constraints. For Naruto, it was the least he could do after finding out about her unhappy home life. Really, he'd always thought having no parents was bad, but having her dad was possibly worse. The guy was an active negative. He'd been upset before the time loop when Niji told him about the caged bird seal, but between that, plus what he'd been worming out of Kurenai and the Hokage, plus what he could get by prompting Hinata, sometimes confronting Niji, also, he was beginning to get an extremely poor opinion of the clan, or at least of the clan head. It had taken weeks of learning her responses, learning how to befriend her quickly and get her to trust him, but in a conversation about how to help Hinata, Kurenai, whom he'd gotten half drunk, had told him of that time she'd picked up the shy girl to take her to the academy for her first class, how she'd warned the father that being a genin was a dangerous path for Hinata. Naruto still felt chilled over her quote of the man's response, that it didn't matter, as Hinata was a failure and the Hyuga clan had no use for her. Then the coldness of Hayashi declaring, if she dies, she dies. Worst of all, he'd said that in front of her with Hinata right there listening. No, in Naruto's mind, the Hyuga clan was a problem that had to be fixed. And the biggest part of that to him was making sure Hinata could be happy. Fortunately, at least that part was easy. He loved that girl, and only part of that was she was the person who'd taught him what love was. Say Kabuto. What have you got on Niji Hyuga? The silver-haired ninja selected a card from deep within. It says here he was last year's top rookie. Unarmed fighting specialist, practicing his family's gentle fist style. His bloodline also makes him a prime contender in the exams. Nothing on the caged bird sealed Naruto though despondently, and nearly turned away before pausing. What's the top card in your deck say? Oh. It's a chart showing the population of the 5 great ninja villages and how they compare to each other. See? Say Kabuto. What's the second card down in your deck say? Oh. That lists off the leaders of the various elemental countries. Here, let me show you. Say Kabuto. What's the third card in your deck say? Oh. Well here, let's see. Ah. That's my listing of the various villages that have hosted the Chunnin exam, in order, ever since I started taking it. Only a memento, really. They never ask. Say Kabuto. What's the 82nd card down in your deck say? Oh. Just picking numbers are you? Well, let's see anyway. That's a neat info card on a girl who died during our last exam. I guess I should throw that one away. What did she die of? Oh, a rain ninja killed her using a rain of needles. It was ugly, but not too unexpected. She just wasn't up to taking the Chunnin test, to be honest. Say Kabuto. What's the 292nd card down in your deck say? Oh, wow, I never expected to be asked anything like that. Just picking numbers out of the air, are you? Well, let's have a look. Ah. It's the bottom one, and it looks like an information chart on Hei 8 Gecko, a special jonin of Konoha and frequently an instructor of the Chunnin exams when they are held locally. It says here that he is in chronically poor health, which is particularly sad since his specialty is swordsmanship, although he is also a master of the shadow clone technique. Thanks, Naruto waved, then paused, turning back to face the silver-haired genin. How do you make those cards, anyway? Kabuto smiled, straightening his glasses. Oh, it's pretty simple. Here, let me show you how to make your own. Do you have a piece of paper handy? Naruto smiled. I'll bring one tomorrow. Well, no need to waste time. I think I have a spare on me. Kabuto started rummaging around in his pouch, but came up nothing. Well, I guess not. Sorry, I guess we'll do it tomorrow. It's not like I have a card I can just erase to show you. Naruto, still smiling, suggested, try cards 82, 103, and 212. Oh, hi Sakura, the blonde, orange-clad genin called out as he blurred past. Pink hair swishing in the breeze of his passage, the girl paused to wonder at Naruto's behavior before continuing on her walk towards the test center. Why hadn't Naruto bugged her? Oi! Nara, she heard him call out in the distance. You up to a shogi game after the test if the examiners don't need us? So troublesome. You wouldn't be any challenge. Win or lose, I'll take Ino off your hands for a day. Deal. Stupid. Why would I agree to such a thing? Ino objected, fists clenched. Because I'll carry your things while you shop, and help you out in your store for the rest of the day, the other yellow-haired genin told her. Ino blinked once, twice, then smiled. Sure. Thanks, Naruto. Behind them, the pink-haired girl stood, blinking over this exchange. Naruto whistled as he skipped along. He was now varying his daily schedule as much as possible. Some days he picked up Hinata at her home and spent the day with her, and those were always nice. He and Hinata had really started to become close friends as he learned more about her, and he'd really started to like her. It was hard not to like her when she already liked him so much. From her perspective, from what she told him, his just suddenly revealing that he liked her too was a gift from heaven. So he could reveal all sorts of knowledge about her likes and dislikes, and she would just assume that he'd somehow miraculously been observing her while she'd stalked him. In short, she'd gladly accept whatever level of friendship he offered her. Naruto had, very quickly, grown to like and appreciate her. Nobody else in all of those repeats had been changing how they acted towards him, except her, so she stood out in that whatever attention he gave her would change her reactions toward him. It had quickly become a lifeline to the endlessly repeating boy. However, he was careful not to rely on it too much, lest that too became boring. And he didn't think he could bear to have his one, true friend start to bore him. He'd rather die. Well, he had died, fairly often actually, and it hadn't stuck, but it was the sentiment that counted. So he reserved those Hinata days for when he really needed them, once a week or so at most, and even so he'd begun to take her out on picnics and so on, varying their dates as much as possible to keep things fresh. Other days, well. Some days he researched, both the Hyuga clan and other topics. The conversations to impress his friends had lost most of their initial luster. By this point, when he started to reveal hidden knowledge, they tested him to find its limits, until that took all day without him learning about any new subjects he hadn't covered. He'd found he could change that when he had a new topic of his own to introduce, but those were hard to think of, as left to their own devices they'd all ask the same questions over again, leading to the same subjects he'd studied before. So he'd taken to breaking into the academy and reading the schoolbooks over, including some texts he had never owned any copies of, and some of which had been sold to him as special copies with information deleted or changed, to teach him wrong answers, just to have fresh material to inject into those conversations, as otherwise they grew too boring. But he had also started to vary whom he'd hang out with on most days. Nara was a bright spot on the otherwise dull backdrop of repetition, in that after the lazy boy had taught him shogi they'd been able to play together, and their games had always been different. Of course, Naruto always lost, but that wasn't the point. Ino was another refreshing person to be around. As he'd begun to expand his circle of friends, Naruto had discovered the girl to be nothing like Sakura was, and yet everything he'd hoped she would be. To put that another way, all of the qualities he'd previously admired about his pink-haired former crush had been taught to her by Ino, who also had none of Sakura's flaws. Well, none except a crush on the Uchiha anyway, but their Ino was capable of listening to reason. Sakura never was, in all of the times he'd tried her. The textbook definition of a chauvinist was a blindly devoted patriot, and by that Sakura was definitely a Sasuke chauvinist. Nothing he did was wrong in her eyes, nor could he do anything wrong as far as she was concerned. Naruto had long since grown tired of it. But luckily, he didn't have to put up with it, as there was nothing that required him to hang around with his team outside of missions. So long as he showed up for tests, they had nothing to complain about. At least until Orochimaru killed them again. And by spending less time with his team, Naruto got to hang out with more interesting people. Ino was one such. By just suggesting one thing or another he could get her to shop for it, and so long as he stayed in disguise, for reasons he found easy to explain to her, they'd go around town shopping for whatever. Doing such, he was learning how to tell good deals from bad, judge prices and product quality, as well as where to get deals, all stuff he'd never known before, as he'd been lucky to get inside a store's door growing up. Those times they shopped for food, she'd also help show him how to cook, which was yet another of those skills he'd never had anyone to teach him as he'd been growing up. His ramen obsession was a function of three things: his desperation to eat something, his inability to shop normally, people sold him old, out-of-date or rancid food as often as possible, and all for premium prices, which was a real problem back before he could read and couldn't tell they were cheating him, and not knowing how to cook on his own forcing him to choose the simplest of all food to prepare, even though it had all of the nutritional value of warm cardboard. It was probably only his healing ability that kept him alive. Well, that and the people at Ichiraku, who were nice to him. No, Naruto was swiftly becoming very fond of Ino, and after shopping, and sometimes a meal, she'd let him help out in her family's flower shop, usually in his sexy Naruto-chan disguise, to avoid scaring off any customers, where he learned about the various flowers, their meanings and properties. So that was good. By now Naruto had exhausted the limits of what Irika could teach on most school subjects. The man was only a Chunnin, and a schoolteacher at that, so while he had a broad grasp of the essential ninja basics on up to Chunnin level, his focus had been down, on teaching Genin, not up, on learning Jonin level techniques or knowledge. But still, while Naruto might not be Chunnin level on most skills, it was nice for him to have the book smarts of his hope for ninja rank, and to be able to calculate a parabola when he needed to. So he went on reading books on those subjects for answers to give Hinata because asking Irika grew to be too much of a pain, as his former teacher took longer to find things than just looking up the answers himself. Next day he was planning on losing a bet with Kiba and paying a forfeit of having to help out around that family's kennel, where he learned almost as many things as at Ino's shop. They just weren't as nice about it, and taught about dogs instead of flowers. After that, well, maybe he'd hang out with the Hokage for a day and prompt the old man to tell him stories. That had started out as a way to learn about his former favorite student, Orochimaru, but it turned out the old guy had a storytelling bone or two in his body, and he'd lived so long and seen so much stuff, all he'd have to do was prompt him the right way and the Hokage never seemed to run out of material, really interesting stuff, too. Yeah. It was worth it. He'd go hang out with the Hokage again after this. After who knows how long training with Ebisu, months of hard work on basic chakra control to be decent, then weeks each spent mastering intricacies of the body switch, basic clone, and transformation techniques, then more months spent on further chakra control exercises until he was tolerable, above average, but barely. The special Jonin had taken him back to the basic essential 3 ninja techniques again until he could perform them without seals, on almost no notice and with hardly any sign he was doing them. It was hardly possible to master them any further. There was only so much you could do to refine something, and he'd about hit that limit. Yes, Ebisu liked to focus on the basics. He considered them important, vital even, or it could just be that he disliked Naruto that much. Once more the blonde genin showed up for his instruction, almost physically able to feel his expectation of the guy wanting to spend more time refining basic techniques, or to show him yet more amino refinements to establish slightly greater chakra control, on the road up to acceptable, almost good. He nearly fell down in a faint when his teacher declared it was time the boy ought to learn a jutsu that wasn't among the basic 3. Finally. At last. He got to learn body flicker, the short-range transportation technique. Okay, it wasn't much, being both low rank and common, almost a calling card for being a true ninja. But hey, he was excited. Kakashi may have 1,000 ninja techniques, but Naruto only had 4 that he hadn't invented himself. One more made a big difference. Sasuke, you do sense something odd about Naruto? HN. Having failed to get a useful response from her crush as he passed by where she sat eating, Sakura went back to her lunch, gazing off at her other teammate, who was laughing and joking with a trio of normally reserved genin from Hidden Sound. The next day it would be Hidden Rain, but she didn't know that. Naruto? A voice asked from the door to his apartment. The boy looked up from what he was doing. Oi! Sakura. I wasn't expecting you. He looked oddly puzzled by that statement, but he hid it well, so she didn't notice. Her mind was preoccupied anyway, but not so much she didn't notice the parts strewn on the floor around him. What are you doing? Oh, the boy gestured casually to the open book on the floor beside him. Learning how to fix things. The lock on my door has been busted for a long time. I thought I'd learn how to repair it. That's nice, the kunoichi mumbled, not really meaning it. So what brings you here, he prompted. Earlier today, I saw you talking with some sound ninja, she stated. I don't think that's right. They could just be using you. They might do anything to get ahead in the exam. What are you doing? Oh, the boy gestured casually to the open book on the counter beside him. Learning how to fix things. The hot water tap in my sink has been busted for a long time. I thought I'd learn how to repair it. That's nice, the kunoichi mumbled, not really meaning it. So what brings you here, he prompted. Earlier today, I saw you talking with some grass ninja, she stated. I don't think that's right. They could just be using you. They might do anything to get ahead in the exam. What are you doing? Oh, the boy gestured casually to the bucket of plaster on the floor beside him with the spreading tool in his hand. Just repairing some of the holes in my walls. It makes it less drafty in here. That's nice, the kunoichi mumbled, not really meaning it. So what brings you here, he prompted. Earlier today, I saw you talking with some sand ninja, she stated. Oh yeah, he brightened. Gaara is the youngest son of the Kazekage, and the other two members of his team are his brother and sister, Kankuro and Temari. Nice folks. Why did you approach them, she demanded, fists clenched in worry. That one with the jug almost killed you. Oh, I just wanted to know why they are going to attack our village, that's all. And being hostile or wanting me dead doesn't make them any different than most of Konoha. Sakura found herself gaping like a fish. Oh, hi Sakura-chan. Naruto called out through the mouthful of nails held between his teeth. What are you doing? She approached, momentarily forgetting why she was there. Oh, I'm just opening up the wall of this room. The apartment next to mine has always been empty, and I got the Hokage's permission to join it to mine so I can have plenty of space for guests to visit. I've got it almost done now. What do you want? Naruto, I just wanted you to know that I saw you flirting with Kiba's sister. That's nice. Could you hand me that wrench, please? Baffled at this response, Sakura did so. Why did you do it? Because it was fun. Why do other people flirt? Sakura had no answer to that. Instead, she looked around her. Why are we in the basement of your apartment building? Naruto confidently spun the wrench around his fingers before making the last adjustments to the pipes. Because this is where the hot water to my apartment got turned off. I'm just turning it back on again. Oh, I had to replace some rusted through and busted up pipes first, though. Someone must have taken an axe to them to make certain I had cold baths. But I was able to salvage spares from a building that's scheduled for demolition. Oh. Naruto, I had no idea your apartment was this good. Sakura looked about herself in amazement while handing him the screwdriver he'd asked for. Yeah, it does look like kind of a dump from the outside, doesn't it? He said through a couple of screws held between his teeth, lying on his back on two boards between two ladders as he did something to his ceiling. What are you doing up there, anyway? Oh, I'm just finished rewiring the place and I thought this would be a good spot to hang a ceiling fan from. What do you think? She thought about it for a second. Wouldn't it be better over there? I was going to put a sofa there, with a coffee table in front and recliners to either side. The table is going to go here. I thought about carpeting, but I think I prefer hardwood floors with some throw rugs on high traffic areas. Yes. Sakura chirped brightly. I think that would look nice. I'm just saying you should have shown up to the test wearing more than your underwear and a cape, that's all. Sakura insisted. Aha, he mumbled, busy fastening upholstery onto a newly assembled recliner frame. Naruto. Could you turn that thing off? I've got to talk to you. What is it, Sakura? The boy lifted up his goggles after turning off the power saw on the workbench. She saw it. What are you doing? Making myself a matching dining room set to go with the remodeled kitchen. Don't touch the table, it hasn't had a chance for the varnish to dry yet and I don't want to have to buff out any fingerprints to get a good, high gloss. Oh. She blinked several times in confusion. What did you want to talk about? He asked, going over to check on the clamps that were currently pressing wood for the curved back chairs. Oi. Sakura. Something you want to talk about? Yeah, I guess. The kunoichi nervously entered the room where he was working. Just a moment, he cautioned, blowing through the hollow wooden rod to expand the ball of glass on the end into a mold. Okay, you can talk now. What are you doing? Making a set of goblets and glasses to go with my new tableware. Why? Immediately on waking up one morning, Naruto created 60 shadow clones that immediately set about performing tasks transforming his house in ways that he himself had practiced up before. 2 more ran off to make purchases around town, including a better set of clothes, a blue outfit based on Kurenai's suggestions. He'd be broke after doing it, but that would reset tomorrow with the rest of it. That afternoon, when he led Hinata to his house for their lunch date, she stood staring, then turned to him with stars in her eyes. I learned how to fix it up since your last visit, he told her, looking the girl fondly in her eyes while gently stroking her chin. Naruto-kun. She leapt into his arms and squeezed him tightly as the romantic atmosphere overwhelmed her. Sighing as it heard this from the next room, the apron-wearing clone in the kitchen turned down the heat on the roast. It looked like dinner would have to be delayed. Sighing fondly as she got told about it later, Kurenai told him, about the only thing you missed was romantic music. Good job, Uzumaki. Music, the boy asked her intently. Nothing must be neglected or forgotten in providing the perfect date to the one girl who'd always believed in him. The next morning had Naruto in his sexy disguise, although fully clothed, looking in a music shop window. Both instruments and lessons were each more than he could afford. So, the next question became, how to get more money. Getting music lessons was easier than Naruto thought. He'd show up disguised as the Uchiha, and they'd fall all over themselves to show him around, let him test various instruments, and even give him a complimentary lesson or two, usually lasting for a couple of hours of decent quality instruction. It was sickening, absolutely revolting, favoritism of the worst sort, and still for all of that a very useful loophole for the poor boy to exploit. And he did not need more than a free lesson or two, given that he was in an endless loop of recycling days, one free lesson became an infinite number of them. The music teachers didn't even question as his skill began to rise, assuming it was the rightful privilege of the last Uchiha to know everything. Well, that was a useful weakness he could exploit in other ways, too. Naruto would be the first to admit that he had no martial arts at all. He had no style, no finesse, and absolutely no understanding beyond the 2-year-old charge the guy and hit him mindset. Heck, in one of the recent visits to the Inuzuka family clinic, helping out after having lost a bet, he'd gotten into an argument with Kiba about being weak, where the dog user had frankly told him that it didn't matter that Naruto knew the shadow clone, because 1,000 times nothing is still nothing. And, well, in all honesty the blonde couldn't deny the truth of his friend's statement. What could you expect after years of teachers who would always arrange to send him to the principal, out on bucket duty, scrubbing erasers, or otherwise getting him out of the way while the rest of the class practiced their martial arts and weapon techniques? Irika had put a stop to that, but by then the damage had already been done, and Naruto, having none of the basics, had tried to compensate by sheer enthusiasm and bloody-minded determination, as he had in so many other areas of his life. Well, now Naruto knew better than anyone that guts and determination didn't make up for having no real skill. And really, he'd already sent thousands of untrained clones up against trained fighters only to have them evaporate like soap bubbles before the skilled guy. No, all he could really do was waste a skilled fighter's time. Even with all of his basic ninja techniques fully mastered, thanks to Ebisu, all he could really do was waste more of the guy's time. He wasn't presenting any danger to the enemy ninja he fought, even when he fought for real. It was depressing, but another thing Naruto had learned was that you could not correct a situation until you accepted what it really was, no matter how much you might not want to face it. And being nothing more than a punching bag on a battlefield was something he felt had to be corrected, and soon. Taking a hit wasn't so serious a weakness for most people using the shadow clone, because taking a hit in combat was usually a very bad thing. Getting a kunai stuck in your chest was a big deal, whether or not you were a clone. So most fighters could go a long time before taking a hit at all. They'd learned to avoid it. It was an integral part of knowing how to fight well. But Naruto didn't know how to fight at all, not with any style, anyway. He'd always plowed forward, shrugging off hits and damage to go smack his enemy. No wonder his clones didn't last long. So he began a plan of attending sets of drills where he practiced with some academy students while under a transformation disguise as they got taught basic combat techniques at classes Naruto had somehow never been invited to. All he had to know was who was out sick that day and hadn't bothered to tell anyone, even if he had to arrange the sick day by tying up the students in question himself. First off, he did this with the poorest students in the lowest grades, that way his own ignorance did not stand out at all. Then, as he gained some degree of competence, he replaced better and older pupils. After he'd done that enough to have a decent grasp of the basics, he would use disguises to impersonate top students and approach teachers for special one-on-one training. It embarrassed him that one of those top students was Konohamaru. But the kid had been having personal instruction under Ebisu for years. Actually, on that note, he deliberately sought out Ebisu disguised as Konohamaru a few times to help get a handle on the basics, because if there was one thing he had learned, it was that Ebisu taught basics relentlessly and well. Although he got a little ashamed at how surprised and pleased the special Jonin got that his prized pupil Konohamaru was listening intently for once. That embarrassment behind him, he sought out Irika as himself for similar treatment. It shocked the Chunnin how much his former pupil had improved, so Naruto told him he'd been seeking private lessons, which, in a way, was true. But even so, there was only so much those two would teach him while still believing he was the person he was passing himself off as, even himself. Still, even after months wherein he'd exhausted all of what the Ninja Academy could do to teach about armed and unarmed fighting, that still only brought him up to where a genin should be. Hey, it was miles above where he'd been before, and it was a top-notch rookie genin he'd ended up impersonating at the end, the best in the academy, so that's where his skill level topped out, as that was where he'd exhausted this opportunity for instruction. But that skill level still wasn't going to make much of a difference against the sort of things he'd been having to fight against. In fact, just to see, he tried his new skills out on Orochimaru, and the Snake Sannin didn't even notice the change. Even the charge of 1,000 skilled genin did not faze him any more than the previous charges of 1,000 unskilled berserkers. Either way, he'd cut them down like grass. But that wasn't the point. No, the point of this whole exercise was still on exploiting what the generous townspeople would give to the Uchiha, usually without question, and glad for the opportunity to do so. And, well, no one who was capable of teaching fighting arts would believe that Sasuke wasn't already a skilled genin. So, now having the fighting skills a proper genin should, and that Sasuke had been using months ago, Naruto was in a position to approach instructors and ask for training. It was sickening how easily he got it, too. However, just as he was on the cusp of great success, he hit a wall and his hopes came crashing down on him. Because the really good instructors noticed something that the ones at the academy never did. Naruto had never internalized those lessons in the way a good fighter had to. Fighting was a very physical art. In order to be good at it, the body itself had to know what it was doing. But due to the endless repeats, nothing physical stayed with him. He couldn't condition his body, nor could he train reflexes. And that was a problem, because the body needed to know what it was going to do. Naruto had trained his mind until it knew it very well, but that wasn't good enough. At that level, he was still thinking about what he had to do to get it right. No, to be good at a physical skill like martial arts required the body itself to have conditioned reflexes so the mind didn't have to think about every step and motion along the way. You'd never get any real speed or free up the mind to think tactically until the complex motions of the actual forms, the stances, punches, blocks and so on, were automatic. The really good instructors wouldn't touch him until he had that, no matter whose face and form he wore, or how perfect the disguise was. They could tell the moment they started teaching him that he was missing that basic and essential element. And even the good ones who stuck with him after that discovery would think only of how to teach it to him. That meant practice, 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 endlessly repeating the proper forms. Only, in Naruto's case, after a reset his muscles wouldn't recall a bit of it. He wasn't sore or tired, but his muscles wouldn't retain the benefit either. And sadly, without that, he was as good as he was going to get, at least as far as the fighting arts were concerned. He wasn't even half as good as he could have been at the same level of knowledge, if only he'd been able to practice in ways that could effectively train his body. In fact, one of those teachers told him straight out that he'd be twice as good as he was now, using only what he already knew, if only his body knew it all as well as his mind did. The teacher had been trying to encourage him, as twice as good as the top academy student, whom he'd been impersonating to get his instruction of late, was almost as good as a rookie Chunnin ought to be, which would put him in the ballpark of where he wanted to be, because he was still taking that test. But instead of encourage him, it ended up having the opposite effect. Naruto had been basing so many hopes on his infinite ability to achieve, using repeats to improve and get better, overcoming all of his former problems and become a better ninja, that to run into a barrier he couldn't cross, on something so basic and fundamental to all of his goals, was difficult not to be shattered by. It was made especially bad by the fact that he'd always fancied himself a close combat ninja, one who'd go right in there and mix it up with an enemy, and his main strategy and primary technique all reflected this. Then to be faced with this, having hit an uncrossable ceiling on his martial arts talents just when he was beginning to feel he could be good at it, and the sure knowledge that if he wanted to improve further he'd have to abandon further progress on that one path and reinvent himself as a ninja. It was a crushing blow to his self-esteem, and merited a Hinata day or two back-to-back just to recover from the hurt of it. Even so, he'd had to cry a bit before he could get over it and accept his new handicap. By the time he'd hit the same limit on his musical studies he was almost resigned to it, having somewhat expected it. But it still hurt. So he still took a week off of any serious training to have a prank vacation to make up for it. Luckily, he could still learn chakra techniques and ninja powers, as those didn't seem to be hurt by a lack of body memory. Naruto had real trouble reinventing himself. It was not that he couldn't think of other types of ninja, but that he'd always been aiming to be Hokage, and a Kage-level ninja couldn't afford any major weaknesses. Weaknesses like, having Genin-level martial arts. Still, he didn't give up hope that he could improve them eventually. It just wasn't going to happen during this time loop thingy. After that, he could go forward with his original plans to impersonate Sasuke to get people to teach him. He'd just have to be more careful not to get caught doing it, as he didn't want to be a Kage-level missing ninja. No, that was sounding too risky. Maybe he could somehow arrange to find a person who was willing to teach him despite being a demon container. That would prove better in the long run. But that was getting distracted from his immediate goals. A Hokage had to be strong in many areas, and martial arts was only one. He could and would deal with that later. For right now, there were plenty of other weaknesses he could be working on improving with the opportunities at hand. For example, there were ninja medics, ninja who focused on special moves or secret powers, elemental wielders, and even illusion specialists. Getting people to teach him cool special moves had been a goal all along, and it hadn't been turning up much. So it seemed best to look to other areas, at least until something opened up. Other than the basic clone technique, Naruto knew next to nothing about illusions, except what Ebisu had said about his transformation not having those same vulnerabilities. He knew that they required power, something he had a lot of, imagination, another area in which he was gifted, and skill. Well, of the lot, the only area he wasn't already well supplied in was skill, and that could be remedied. The only thing now was some instructions to follow, and he could get started. And, it just so happened that one of those people the Hokage was regularly sending him off to learn under was Kurenai, who was an illusion specialist. Feeling buoyed up by this new hope, Naruto bounced up out of bed and set off to go see Kurenai. Holding a letter from the Hokage in her hands, the illusion mistress was speaking in a somewhat resigned tone of voice. The problem, Uzumaki, is that not everyone can learn to use illusions, certainly not the higher-ranking ones. You need a good imagination, which I'm sure you have, but also good chakra control, which I'm just as sure you don't. The boy took a deep breath and responded reasonably, "Are you sure you can't give me some test? I've got the basic clone fully mastered, and without the use of seals. I'm willing to work hard, he pled. The Jonin sighed. She hated giving kids bad news, but this one practically pled for it. Okay, show me your clone. He did, and she was impressed. It appeared before she'd even finished asking, and the kid hadn't used any hand seals to do it. The tiniest wisp of smoke was the only sign of its appearance, and without that she would have suspected the kid of having already hid a clone around a corner just waiting for her to ask before bringing it out. I'm impressed. She nodded her head. That's as good a clone as I've ever found. The problem is all of the other illusions are at least a full rank higher. How good is your chakra control, really? Above average, he told her earnestly, leaving out the barely part of that Ebisu had tacked on when he told him his grade, because when he did tack it on she'd turn him down based on that. Of course, he'd been about as low on control as you could get before the whole time loop thing, and since she didn't know about the loops, but had heard about his abysmal control through the Jonin grapevine, she didn't believe what he'd said, thinking he was just trying to butter her up. Show me, she told him straight out. How, he pled, and when she began to look at him askance he blurted, the leaf floating exercise? Sure. No problem. I can do wall and water walking too, if you want me to. Plainly doubtful, she motioned for him to continue, and so he took a fresh leaf out of his pouch before causing it to hover above his forehead, where he held it with only minor spins or wobbles. It was good, but not good enough. Korinai was a little surprised. You were right. You do have above average chakra control, if only barely. She didn't see him hide his wince as she stood up. But when I said good control I meant it. Sorry, Uzumaki, but I really do need a student to have good control, or I'd just be wasting my time. Waste 1 hour? Just 1 hour? He pled with her again, this time clasping his hands together and dropping to his knees, making the Jonin feel terrible about it as she shook her head and departed, leaving Naruto alone. The boy sighed, dropping his pose and feeling depressed. This conversation had been the product of numerous repeats where he'd been trying to convince her and learning how to play her reactions to gain the best of all possible chances. Not even showing her his unique transformation helped, as she was able to pick it out as not an illusion right off the bat, and she was only going to qualify him based on illusions, or better chakra control than he had. He'd asked for less time before, but the illusion mistress had said she couldn't give a complete lesson in less than an hour. So, maybe illusions would have to wait a while? There were also, he reflected, seals. And one of the greatest known masters of that specialty was in Konoha right now, peeping on bathhouses. But since Jiraiya would not teach him anything else, he doubted he'd teach him that. Sigh. Back to Ebisu for more chakra control, he figured. Since it was still early in the day, and he'd passed the written test, the only times he got a note to see Hinata's teacher from the Hokage were when he'd passed the written test. It would be another 2-day wait before he could see the special Jonin again if he went by the ordinary schedule. Not wanting to delay that long, Naruto forged a note to Ebisu from the Hokage. He'd seen it often enough to be able to copy it with his eyes closed. It would get caught later, not having any of the proper security seals, but it could have non-functional copies written on, and by the time they caught it he'd have already reset anyway. Naruto had been meeting with Ebisu far less often of late. It wasn't that he didn't want to know what the special Jonin had to teach him, but that most of the things he taught were ones he'd learned already. The same pointers and exercises to perfect one technique were often the same ones he'd taught him to perfect another. So, really, he didn't have to visit him as often to get the same value. What Naruto would do was practice on his own during normal hours of his daily schedule while busy doing other things, checking in periodically with the teaching specialist to make sure he was on the right path. But really, he'd gotten good enough at teaching himself that only rarely did the special Jonin have something to say that contradicted what he'd already been doing. So, it saved time and was less frustrating to go through the exercises and drills and stuff for perfecting his techniques on his own. Still, it was an old and tired routine even so, showing up and going through the motions of the tests Ebisu gave him, turning this way, then that, lifting one leg, and assuming martial arts stances, which were now substantially improved over what he'd originally done, but that only served to remind him of that barrier he couldn't cross, and irritate him further. Very well, tell me what techniques you already know. Naruto sighed, beginning again the litany. My basic 3 are fully mastered, sealless and almost traceless. Body flicker likewise. I also know the shadow clone, and 2 unique distraction techniques of my own devising, but you already know about those, the boy finished with a knowing grin. Ebisu coughed and adjusted his glasses, attempting to master a slight blush. Yes, well. Naruto smiled, that jibe was intentional, and had often saved him from an hour of tests as his teacher made him prove those claims. It also saved him from having to reveal his transformation was an S-rank solid variant rather than the usual illusionary one. Apparently deciding something, the teacher casually pulled a scroll out of his pouch and tossed it to him. Here, that is a treatise on basic elemental tips and chakra control exercises. Why don't you practice that for a while? As the special Jonin walked off, leaving him, Naruto's face was screwed up in agony and his fists were clenched tightly over the scroll. You mean this guy had that with him the entire time? It was all he could do not to follow after Ebisu and hit the guy. Mastering his ire, the boy sat down to memorize that scroll, not just read it, but completely commit the contents to memory so he didn't have to do the whole routine with Ebisu to see it again. His memory had been substantially improved by his time stuck in all of these repeating days, and it had gotten better faster once he'd unlocked some of his mental power after he'd begun to really read. But, bless the library, there had been a few books in there on enhancing memory. It was a shinobi village, after all, and they often had need to remember things without writing them down. So he put himself to work memorizing that scroll, and would call himself done only once he could copy it out by hand from memory. After that, he'd start to work on those things it described. He fell asleep in the forest while still studying that scroll. For the second time in his life, Naruto opened his eyes to a person bending over him, after having slept all night in a forest, exhausted from too much training. Hi, you know it isn't safe to be out here all night. There are bears and things in these forests. Groaning, Naruto sat up, looking at who'd addressed him. Ten, right? On the same team as Neji and Rock Lee? The girl was surprised. Yeah. How'd you know? I make a point of learning about those around me, particularly those who might be stronger than me. It's a good ninja strategy. He waved airily. The girl laughed, tilting her head to say, sorry, but you don't look like a very good ninja, with that grass and leaves in your hair. Tactfully, she didn't state that his reputation as a deadlast was well known around the village, spread by people crowing in delight over how weak he was. That's okay, he knew it too. I thought the point of being a ninja was deception, the boy shot back with a wide, friendly grin, running fingers through his hair to get the leaves out. The girl thought about it and conceded, okay, what do you know about me? The boy shrugged, and sat there, thinking. Well, obviously I know about your team and Jonin instructor, but that's not so much about you, is it? You hang out with Neji a lot and train alongside him because neither of you want to train at the pace that Lee or your instructor set. You specialize in weaponry, and your teacher says that you can hit a bullseye 100 out of 100 times. Most of your weapons you summon from scrolls you carry with you, and your most powerful technique is your Rising Twin Dragons, where you jump up high summoning dozens of weapons out of 2 scrolls which you throw in a really fast barrage at your target. By now the female genin was surprised. That kid really did know some stuff about her. But Naruto wasn't finished. He was scratching his head. Some girls around town say you have a crush on Neji, but don't think he returns it. You want to prove that female ninja can be as strong as males ones, and you admire Tsunade, the slug Sannin. Wow! You really do know a lot about me. The girl was impressed, and trying hard to hide both her blush at the crush thing, and her disappointment that her peers felt she wasn't getting through to the Hyuga boy. Reading her face expertly, Naruto felt a little ashamed and tried to soften the blow. Don't worry too much about the Neji thing. The guy can be a bit of a pain, but he's really unhappy himself. The Hyuga family have this big thing where the main house are rulers over the branch house, who they treat like slaves. They even put a brand on their forehead, a seal that can kill them if they disobey. Neji's father was the twin of the clan head, but because he was born a few seconds later he got stuck in the branch house. He resents Hinata because he doesn't think she is strong enough to be in the main house. And then his dad got sacrificed to save the life of his twin, who was her father. So, yeah, he's got issues. He tried to finish off with a merry chuckle, but it came out sounding nervous. Tenten's eyes were wide. How did he know all this? She'd been a teammate of Niji's for over a year now and never heard any of this. I'm kinda dating Hinata right now, Naruto concluded lamely to cover the question he could see in her eyes. The whole thing upsets her. Concluding that he had to be right, girls were more talkative than boys, the girl relaxed, then changed the subject. So what are you doing out here all alone? Happy to be back on a safe topic, and deciding he could even tell the truth, Naruto held up the scroll he'd been studying. Oh, training to be a better ninja. I don't have many techniques, and this was supposed to help me. I guess I got so tired reading it that I fell asleep. He. She smiled.